In the remote village of Black Hollow, a dense forest stretched for miles, known locally as the Vale. The townsfolk warned against entering it after dark, for the Vale was said to belong to the Hollow Ones, figures of shadow and silence that moved between the trees, always watching, never blinking. They weren't spirits or men, but something in between, born of darkness and despair. When 19-year-old Mira arrived to visit her estranged grandmother, she dismissed the stories as superstition. She was a city girl, after all, and no stranger to urban legends. Her grandmother's house sat at the edge of the vale, its crooked frame leaning like a weary traveler. The air around it was heavy, carrying a faint, acrid smell. "You'll lock the doors at night," her grandmother said over tea, her wrinkled hands trembling. "And you'll never look into the trees. If you hear them whisper, you'll hum a tune and go to bed." Mira smiled politely, though she didn't believe a word. That night, as the moon hung low over the vale, Mira lay in bed scrolling through her phone. Outside, the wind howled, and the trees seemed to sway unnaturally, their branches scratching against the windows like claws. It started as a faint hum, low and melodic, barely audible over the creak of the house. She thought it was the wind at first, but then it grew louder, sharper, and more rhythmic. It wasn't wind. It was a voice, or maybe voices, chanting in unison, though the words were incomprehensible. Curiosity got the better of her. Mira crept to the window, peeking out into the vale. The forest was alive. Shadows moved between the trees, flickering and darting like whispers given form. And then she saw them, figures standing just beyond the tree line. They were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs stretched unnaturally, their faces featureless save for hollow, gaping holes where eyes should have been. Mira gasped and stumbled back, but one of the figures turned. Though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze pierce through the walls and lock onto her. The humming stopped. Then came the knock. A single, deliberate knock at the front door echoed through the house. Mira froze. Another knock followed, louder and more insistent, shaking the walls. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind. Never open the door. She crept down the stairs, her heart pounding, and pressed her ear to the door. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, rasping voice. "We see you, Mira." Her blood ran cold. Her name sounded wrong, as though spoken by something that didn't quite understand how words worked. The voice continued, overlapping with others, all chanting in unison, "Come into the forest. Join us in the hollow." She backed away, clutching her chest. The windows began to rattle, and the acrid smell grew stronger, choking the air. Then the front door creaked open, not fully, but enough for her to see outside. The figures stood there closer now, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Their elongated limbs reached toward her, their fingers unnaturally long and jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Mira turned and ran upstairs, slamming her bedroom door and locking it. She could hear them now, whispering from every direction. "You cannot hide. The Vale is ours." The walls began to ripple as though they were breathing, and shadows seeped in through the cracks, pooling on the floor like spilled ink. One of the shadows rose, forming into a thin, towering figure. It tilted its head, mimicking human movement, but wrong, like a puppet with broken strings. Mira's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Trembling, she picked it up. The screen displayed a message. "Look behind you." She turned slowly. The figure was inches away, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. It reached out, its fingers grazing her cheek, leaving an icy burn that seared through her skin. She screamed and backed into the corner, but the shadows continued to close in. The next morning, her grandmother found the house eerily silent. Mira's bed was empty, her phone on the floor, its screen cracked. The front door stood wide open, and faint footprints led into the vale, where the trees whispered her name. The Hollow Ones never let their prey go. If you walk by the vale at night, you might hear them chanting, and if you're foolish enough to listen, you'll see Mira standing among them, tall, thin, and hollow-eyed, waiting for the next visitor.